Today, we are going to have presenters from various African countries presenting on various studies that have been done on almost for 2 years now, looking at democracy in Africa. We would hear from the various researchers, especially from their country's perspective, democratic trends, issues around our accountability, how do we promote democracy, how are countries faring, why are some resilient, and then some are fluttering. So today here, we'll have an overview of the project. We'll have our various presenters. Then we'll have practitioner panel to discuss further on these issues. But before we start, please help me welcome our Executive Director, CDD Executive Director, Prof. H. Kwesi Prempeh, to give us the welcome remarks before we start. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the Ghana Center for Democratic Development for this important dissemination event. This is a project, as Baby said, that's been ongoing for some time with our partners, anchored by Brookings Institution in Washington, with partners in other African countries. And it's about democracy. Democracy is, of course, back in the news. For us, our CDD is always in the news. I mean, it's in our name. So we do democracy every day. But I think for a lot of people, democracy is one of those things that you hear episodically being discussed. And these days it's in the news often for all kinds of not too good reasons. I think it's almost become a cliche when we say democracy is not an event. It's a process. It's a journey. But I think sometimes we also forget that the journey is not linear. It doesn't follow a straight line or path. There are detours, there are patches on the road, there are reverses actually, even. You know, it's more like Accra Kumasi Road. You know, it's not quite a highway. You know, it has all kinds of detours, all kinds of bad patches, and we're plenty of it. But we keep moving, right? So the conversation started. I think we started to talk about backsliding, democratic backsliding, sometime in the last maybe 10 years or so. And then, you know, there are others who decided that, well, instead of looking at the glass as half empty, maybe let's look at it a bit half full, and let's also look at the resilience cases, those cases that, notwithstanding all the odds that democracy may be encountering, there are cases that where we can also see democracy continuing to forge ahead and withstanding all kinds of reverses and detours and patches. So we have scholars here who have been working on this, trying to understand what is it about a country or a society or state that makes its democracy resilient. What makes it possible for some cases to survive, withstand all these pressures that we're all under. And I think knowing that is important so that we can work to improve in those areas where we find possibilities for resilience, and then also to better understand where the weaknesses are and the like. So these are it's not purely academic. In my view, actually, there's nothing purely academic. Everything that academics and scholars do really has a lot of practical everyday relevance. So this is one of those things, trying to bridge research and practice, as we say at CDD. And so this is a very important subject for us. This is our bread and butter here at CDD, so we are interested in these things. And we're very glad that we have the partnership with Brookings to really advance this kind of conversation. So we have some of the big hitters from Brookings, Daniel Resnick and Landry Signe, who are very famous people in the democracy world. They study and write about Africa and a lot. But I've also partnered with our own George Fosu and Karuti Kanjinga from Kenya and others who are here today and who will be presenting on this. So a warm welcome to all of you. This is important stuff. Resilience is all the rage these days, so we want to know from you, what is it about Ghana? I see Ghana included. You know, I will not tell you what I think of our democracy, but I think the Accra Kumasi metaphor sums it up a bit. You know, we still go to Kumasi, and we go on the road, and we survive it. So somehow the democracy is moving here. So thank you for this work, very important. Please contribute. It's fascinating stuff. Thanks.
Okay. Now we have Landry from Brookings to also give us some welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavis. Hello, everyone. We are speaking about democracy. Hello, everyone. I love that energy and that enthusiasm. So I would first like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Kwasi Prempeh for the very warm welcome. It's always a pleasure to be in Ghana. I think there is no better term than the Akwaba, which really represent how welcoming the people of Ghana are. So, oh, I want to know that. I want to know that one. Did I hear it? Can you say it for everyone?
Obake.
Obake. Oh. Obake and Obake. Obake, Obake. So we'll find the right, the right balance. So I'm Landry Signé, and I'm a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. And I'm also a professor and executive director at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. The state of democracy in Africa first began about a couple of years ago. Like Daniel and I sat down and we were discussing how to explain the evolution and the trajectory and the state of democracy in Africa. So that was one of the dimensions, which is more academic type, so the idea to understand the drivers of democracy. But the second dimension, what type of interventions allow to strengthen democracy in Africa? So what build resiliency? And I think that is that second dimension that we are especially excited about, given the prospect that they provide to really shape political outcome and societal outcome overall. And when we think about it, this project will not be more timely. I am also the host and executive producer of the Foresight Africa podcast. And what happened on a Thursday, I think, I interviewed the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Madagascar. We're planning to post her individual podcast interview as Minister of Foreign Affairs. By the time we edited the video, the government, she was not anymore in the government because of the change which happened in Madagascar. And I will not talk about Cameroon. Do you all know what happened in Cameroon? Okay. And I will not talk about Tanzania. Do you all know what happened in Tanzania? So I think, like Nicolas van der Waal said in one of his previous book, but I think which is very relevant today, is there is no more exciting time to study democracy and democratic development than now, because it's about how it affects our life. So, and the stake of democratization have never been as clear, and we selected a group of the most brilliant scholar globally on the specific country to work on the question. So we have had, for example, and I think George was already mentioned, the award winner political scientist. I think please give a round of applause to George, one of your own, and so, of course, with the broader team, and Mavis is there, as you have Daniel. Where is Daniel? And, oh, just in front of me, and Adam. So really, we want to express a deep gratitude to the team Ghana. I think despite having many competing priorities, they have really done everything above and beyond what was expected, and the quality of the work is incredible. So thank you. So, of course, we have also had another partner. So CDD-Ghana was one of our partners. We have over 18 scholars involved in the project. And we also have our partner from Kenya. And I see IDS is very well represented by the distinguished Professor Karuti. So please give him also a very warm welcome. And other, I typically don't like to start naming people, although I do, because the minute you start naming people, if you forget what name, what happened? The person will hate you. So IDS and CDD Ghana were our two core partners because of the leadership they play in the study of democratization in Africa, or political regime in general in Africa. But we had 5 countries, as I mentioned, Ghana, but also Kenya. We had the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have no author represented during this workshop, but they will join us in a future dissemination. We also have Mali with our dearest friend who is also here, Jamie. Can you raise your hand? You will see her very soon. So one of the finest political scientists, especially specialized on democratization, among many other topics. And we also have Zimbabwe, Chipo, Professor Chipo, Professor Chipo, who impressed many of us have known her through her intervention in conferences, totally random, and say, oh, did you hear about that impressive scholar? So I would like, the same way that I express my gratitude to the Kenyan team, to also express my gratitude to overall to both teams from Kenya and from Ghana, because without the partnership of the strategic partnership, we will have not achieved what, what we have done. And from the Brookings Institution, of course, my own Professor Gimke, who is the director of the Africa Girlfriend Initiative, which has been a key player behind this work, but also the one who looked down because he doesn't want me to call his name, Dafe Oputu. Please give him a very warm welcome, who has been behind the work, ensuring the quality process and managing the project, as well as acting as scholar. He's just finishing his PhD. Probably by the end of the year, he'll be Dr. Dafe. And of course, Nicole Grossman, Nicole Tungire, and someone came to me and said that they were familiar to Nicole Tungire. So hello, hello. Thank you for giving us Nicole. So she helped a lot in the work that we have done. And of course, our comms team, including Izzy Taylor and Esther. Finally, I think achieving such an extraordinary work when you are with a team of extraordinary scholars require collaboration. And when you have a co-director of project who is working with you, committed to quality independence impact, the word become almost as a breeze. So please also give a very warm show of appreciation to Daniel Risnik. So Daniel, it's always a pleasure working with you, and that is just the beginning of the collaboration for, I hope, many more decades to come. So there's a lot that I can say about the driver of democracy, about the key interventions, but I think as we have also Daniel, who will be speaking just after me, as well as our distinguished panelists and authors, I will stop here. I'm used to speak for hours, so I have to stop now. So if not, we'll be still here tomorrow. So again, I want to also express my deep gratitude to all of you who came here early this morning to engage with us, as well as to our distinguished panelists from civil society and among others who came also here to share their word of wisdom. Please give a round of applause to all of them. On that note, thank you so much again, and I give the floor now to Daniel Risnik, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and also a senior fellow at IFPRI. Give her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Landry. It's going to be very hard to top Landry's enthusiasm. Hopefully he's got us all excited and our blood rushing to talk about democracy. So like Landry said, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, to really give you a flavor of some of the work that we've been doing with a fantastic team over the last 2 years and see what resonates with you, hear from you about your own insights on democracy. As we've noted a few times, and as Landry was pointing out, this has been a huge effort with a fantastic team, about 17 or 18 scholars from across Africa, also the UK, the US, and Canada. And as he already mentioned, our two institutional partners, CDD and IDS in Kenya. So, I mean, I think as both Professor Prempeh and Landry already noted, I think we're all kind of at an interesting turning point with democracy. When we started this project 2 years ago, we were already grappling with a range of countries that were backsliding. And of course, some of these dynamics have been exacerbated even in the last year. The International Democracy and Electoral Assistance think tank based in Sweden, their most recent report on democracy that came out in September noted that last year 94 countries, or more than half of the world's countries, declined in at least one factor related to democratic performance. So that could have been related to rule of law, rights, representation, or participation in the political process. In the African context, the Varieties of Democracy Project has noted that democracy trends in the region have reverted to their 2000 levels. So in 2000, we had 15 countries that were considered electoral or liberal democracies, and more than 2 decades later, we still have the same number of countries that remain at that level. That doesn't mean the same countries have stayed as electoral or liberal democracies. We've seen a lot of volatility. The Mali case, for instance, that you'll hear about is a notable example in that regard. And so, unfortunately, the other end of the spectrum is we've had many more countries that have stayed autocracies over that period. Globally, including in my own country, in the US, we have been seeing wavering faith in democratic processes, growing loss of public trust in some contexts, polarization motivated by populist parties and misinformation. And of course, we've seen, Landry referred to Madagascar, we've seen just in the few weeks, but certainly over the last year, a number of protests either pushing to oust governments or, really fighting against corruption and inequality and democratic mismanagement. In Africa, the ACLED project has noted that protests over the last 2 decades in Africa have increased by more than 35-fold, right? Going from around 317 protests in the early 2000s to more than 11,000 just last year. So as Landry already highlighted, a real motivation for this project was what explains some of these, various trajectories that we see. Some countries staying very strong, some countries staying autocratic, and then a lot moving in and out of democracy over time. So that was kind of our initial motivation. And then we were really curious about what are some of the tipping points? What are some of the stressors or the opportunities that kind of boost countries into becoming more resilient, or that actually are missed opportunities and they further entrench autocracy. And then something that we really want to spend most of our time talking about today is, given this variety of democratic trajectories, regardless of where a country is, what are certain policy interventions that could be tailored to those democratic frailties in order to perhaps increase resilience over time? We like this resilience analytical lens. We know this is being quite overused in the current context. We talk about household resilience, economic resilience, climate resilience. But this notion of resilience, I think, really is quite useful also in the democratic context, because it's really allowing us to think about the strength of our institutions, our norms, our behaviors, is really only recognized when it's facing some type of crisis or some type of stress, where we can see how those institutions stand up, how our own behaviors, our ideologies, our norms stand up in the face of those crises. And as Landry already alluded to, we do have a kind of a structured comparative design. Why did we pick these 5 countries? We picked these 5 countries because they provide us, of course, that variation in the democratic trajectories we're interested in. They also offer us a little bit more variety in terms of colonial heritage as well. And so what we have up here on the screen is using the varieties of democracy data. This is mapping electoral democracy, and they measure it on an index from 0 to 1. And so 0 is worse, 1 is best. And it's mapping the data on the horizontal axis, which is from 2004, vis-a-vis the 2024, so 20 years later, where the country stood. And countries that are along the diagonal line, these are basically countries that haven't moved. They're basically the same place they are today that they were 20 years ago. And so you can see Ghana is been doing pretty well. Of course, we always have caveats of any system, but relative to some of its peers, it's been doing really well. And so that is our strongest kind of democratic resilience category. Then we have Kenya, so countries that are above the diagonal, this means they were doing a bit better in 2024, and countries below are doing worse. So Kenya is, not quite as strong in terms of levels of democracy, but it has improved over time. And we see that in our cases as an example of bounce back resilience. If you think back to 2007 and 2008, the terrible electoral violence that happened in Kenya, where over 1,000 people died, Kenya has really blossomed since then. A really strong judiciary, other types of institutions, always with caveats that I'm sure Professor Kanyinga will highlight. Of course, the other end of the spectrum is we have countries that have been relatively stable in terms of their more autocratic leanings. So our example in this case is Zimbabwe. And there have been a few missed opportunities where Zimbabwe, we could have seen perhaps a greater kind of democratic opening in 2008, for example, or when there was the ouster of Robert Mugabe several years ago. The DRC, also at that lower end of the spectrum, but it has seen some improvements over time. And it also had some great opportunities, particularly after the 2006 elections. What's really notable with the DRC is, despite some weaknesses on what we say vertical and horizontal accountability, it actually is a very, very strong civil society dynamic. And then lastly, Mali stands out as one that's fallen quite far below vis-a-vis its 2004 scores. And so we see this as what's called a failure of breakdown resistance. The country was not able to kind of resist this breakdown, deteriorate electoral democracy to effectively a junta regime. So you're going to hear in just a moment some of the policy implications given these contexts. And we think about these in terms of different types of accountability. Vertical accountability is really looking at the relationships between parties and voters and the strength of elections. And so here you're going to hear about some examples of interventions that have either worked or that could be tailored to national context. George is going to talk about opportunities for training grassroots party activists in Ghana. We're going to hear in Kenya about opportunities for comprehensive campaign finance reform. And in Mali, I think Jamie's going to allude to opportunities for getting political parties to engage in greater debate. Diagonal accountability is typically referring to the oversight that civil society, trade unions, religious organizations, the media can provide, the transparency they can provide, and the responsiveness they demand from political elites. And so you'll hear about some other opportunities for enhancing this, including citizens' assemblies in Mali, and in Zimbabwe, opportunities to invest in civil society groups that support human rights, or thinking about incentives for greater diaspora engagement there. And then finally, on horizontal accountability, these is usually referring to the institutions that provide checks and balances, particularly over the executive. If you think about the legislature or audit bodies or the judiciary. So there's some really innovative ideas being thought about here too, opportunities to having citizens deliberative councils to monitor whether legislatures are actually implementing what citizens are expecting. And then in the DRC context, and we unfortunately don't have our DRC colleagues with us, but I did want to highlight some of the innovations they've been looking at, particularly with regards to military-civilian relations. So one of their proposals is eliminating discretionary benefits that the military often gets, and this fosters politicization and kind of creates, who's loyal within the military and who's not. And also pushing for greater independent investigation into Army finances. So I just wanted to conclude by putting up the QR code for our project website. We have a lot of great resources there. It's still being continuously populated with more and more, but we have some great blogs. We have all the reports that you're going to hear about today, and a number of podcasts that Landry has hosted. So again, thank you so much for having us today, and looking forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you, Danielle. Now let me invite Landry back to moderate the next session. That will be preceded by presentations.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you again, Danielle, for the wonderful overview of the key trends. So now I will call both George Ofosu from CDD-Ghana and London School of Economics to join me on the panel, and also Kayinga Oscar Otele. If you can both join me, and we'll start with George. If you can put the presentation of George on the screen. And the panel will present a different set of country analyses from across Africa, at explaining when democracies stay resilient and when they backslide, and what sustain democracy, which type of interventions are important in advancing democratic development. And this is how we'll proceed. We will have a couple of presentation, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. And we'll move to the next presentation, have also about 10 minutes of Q&A related to those, to the second presentation. And if we have more time, we can take additional questions. So we want this to be the most interactive possible. So Professor Karuti, you can join the panel. And we'll give the floor to Professor George Ofosu. So please give him a very warm welcome.
morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So, well, let's start from the good story. Not according to HK Pemper, but we'll start from there. Just as Laundry said, this project was done by myself, Daniel, Amato here, Mavis, and Adam Salome, who couldn't join us today. But we've been mulling over the state of Ghana's democracy for the past year, and we want to tell you what we think is happening, what is the state of Ghana's democracy, and what we think are the potential gaps that needs to be filled in terms of building resilience into the future. All right. So Ghana's democracy is obviously a superstar when you think about it in the international context, as we saw in Daniel's graph. 32 years of democratic spell. That has been the longest the country has experienced since independence. So that's quite impressive. It features competitive, progressively free and fair elections. There have been peaceful transfer of power between two major parties 5 times. And by some political science metrics, essentially, Ghana's democracy is consolidated. There is a vibrant media. What our own prof has said ignited what, generated what is called a culture of loudness, a complete departure from the dictatorial regimes where we have a culture of silence. Now everyone speaks on the media and we are freely expressing ourselves. There's an effective civil society group that is championing democratic development. There's high popular support for democracy among citizens. So if you follow the Afrobarometer data over time, people continue to support democracy, and that is a good thing. That has been, good for Ghana's democratic trajectory. When we sort of reviewed the literature on what might help us explain Ghana's democratic success or consolidation over time, I think at least 4 things that we think were important came to fore. One is about the liberal constitution that we have. The 1992 constitution have imperfections, but at the same time, it provides some sort of normative framework within which the political actors have been operating for the past 30 years or so. It guarantees political and civil liberties. It provides for independent judiciary, at least in theory, independence of the legislature and so on. So those have been an important features of the Ghana's democracy. We have a strong 2-party system who we think perhaps have captured the whole democratic process, but you need political parties to help in any democracy. And Ghana's 2 major parties have performed their role as political actors, recruiting, candidates, fielding candidates, forming government, holding governments to account, and so on. The vibrant media has played a major role, and we have an evolving democratic culture, which I mentioned. People are supportive of democracy, but also when you think about the transfer of power between elites, that speaks to the idea that we have come to sort of accept democracy as a way that we want to govern ourselves. Okay? But what are some of the challenges that Ghana's democracy faces? I mean, apart from the rosy picture, there has been stagnation when it comes to the continuous reform of the liberal institutions that we have. So ideas about separation of powers continue to be concentrated in the hands of the executive, and so that is really bad for governance, and reforms in these areas have stalled over time. Electoral institutional reforms like enabling a level playing field for other parties to emerge and so on has still stalled over the past few years. An important factor that we want to emphasize here is about the idea of election quality. So in spite of the progress that has been made, we still see vote buying in our elections, voter registration fraud, election day fraud and violence, and political vigilantism. There is also some level of undemocratic attitudes that is far beyond a threshold that we would like. Even though there's massive support for democracy, there's still that like undemocratic undertones in the Ghanaian society that needs to be addressed moving forward. Okay. So this is just a graph, and Danielle mentioned the Varieties of Democracy Index. If you look at Ghana's trajectory over time, we can see that in the first decade of Ghana's transition in 1992, we made some massive progress, and then things have stalled over time when it comes to the liberal aspect of our democracy. It has basically stalled. In fact, when we think about elections, which we are supposed to be good at, there is a massive increase here, it's stalled, and then we see a dip over the last few years. Okay? So that's just a problem. When you disaggregate, you just see that elections remains a fault line for the country that needs to be tackled. All right? Now, one last thing that I want to mention, which is about the undemocratic attitudes. We often look at how many people or what proportion of people support different dimensions of democracy. So electoral democracy, thinking about freedom of association, free expression, support for decision makers to be elected through the ballot. We often look at the positive side. But to think about whether democracy is consolidated or not, we need to look at what proportion of citizens are on the other side, do not support these institutions. And to that, our own friend Larry Diamond, in one of his books, suggests that if you have folks above the 15% threshold who don't think that these institutions are important, we should be concerned about. And if you look at some of these dimensions, we see that the proportion of Ghanaians who do not support these dimensions are above this 15%. Some are over 20%, especially when it comes to freedom of the press or freedom of expression. And that sort of explains some of the reasons why you have attacks on the media in the past that citizens think that it's okay in some way. But we have to be concerned about that moving forward. Okay, so the way we will want to describe the Ghanaian state of democracy at the moment is that it seems like an unprincipled liberal democratic order that we have. Elites and citizens display some sort of undemocratic practices. National elites comply with transfers of power whilst they encourage grassroots to engage in electoral malpractices. And whilst many citizens support democracy, a substantial minority of people tolerate some sort of illiberal democratic practices. Okay? All right. So how do we propose, what sort of reforms do we propose? We encourage you to read our report, but I want to highlight one of the things that we think should be done in the next few years ahead. We propose some sort of a mid-range approach to dealing with political parties in Ghana. Now, if we want to build a democracy, I think one of the things we want to do is to have a democratically oriented political parties. At the national level, we see that things are going well, but at the grassroots, things are not going well. If we want parties to behave democratically, one of the things we could do is to build their capacity, which is like a top-down approach, encourage them to behave well in elections, but also encourage voters to hold them to account if they behave undemocratically. So now we do debates, making sure that they campaign on policies rather than vote by, and that's more like a bottom-up approach. Now, we have left out this grassroots, which is the mobilizers who mobilize voters on behalf of political parties, campaign on behalf of parties, but also carry out leads. So they sort of sit in the middle. And by tackling these grassroots actors, we have an opportunity to shape not only their behavior, but also the way the national elites behave in elections. Okay? So because I'm out of time, let me use one more minute to brush up some things that we have done over the past few months. We try to sort of understand what is the democratic attitude and values of grassroots of the two major parties, the MPP and NDC in Ghana. We focused only in the Greater Accra regions. We looked at the perceptions of these actors on our democratic experiment. So basically, 58 people, 58 local party executives were interviewed just in Accra, just as a pilot to test how they think about democracy. So what are the motivations? I think one of the popular assumptions about these actors is that they are in it for their pockets. So they want patronage, they want government jobs, and that is why they carry out these undemocratic practices, like engage in violence on behalf of the. But if you talk to them, the motivation that they carry into being party members and serving in leadership positions sort of strikes around affective love, loyalty, family legacy for parties. They were born into the parties, so they want to defend the party's popularity. They have instrumental, they want to serve their community in leadership and so on. But they see themselves in all the roles that I've mentioned, so that I wouldn't do that. But I want to emphasize their democratic values, which is quite disturbing. This is negative attitudes towards democracy. So do they support equality before the law? Like those who say they don't, measured in way which you should read in our report, are that 53% of these local party actors, which is really high. Whether they support, if your opponent removed your electoral commission, should you also remove that electoral commission if you come into power? About 43% believe so. Right? So there is some undertone of weakness attitude among these party grassroots that needs to be tackled. So three main proposals. First, foster liberal attitudes, democratic norms, promote policy-based intra-party elections, but also institutionalize inclusive policy-making dialogue within the parties when it comes to national policy issues and so on. So I would end there and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, George, for a wonderful presentation, and I'm certain we will have a vibrant conversation during the Q&A session. Now, allow me to give the floor to Professor Karuti Kanyinga. So, would you mind elaborating on building resilient democracies, campaign finance issues, and reforms in Kenya?
Maje. Maje Bill. Ah, good. You see, I am learning a lot. Maje. Good. Let me begin by what Professor Prempe gave us an example of how democracy in Ghana may look like. The road from Accra to Kumasi. That road is actually not that bad. You travel from Ghana as you meet the bypass. Yes, it is clogged as you go to get the new bypass. The road becomes narrower. But there are several places where you can get palm wine on the way. You stop somewhere, you have a palm wine, and as you hit the traffic, you begin again. Potholes on the side, but the road becomes narrower. There are bushes on the side, but you are still moving. As you go on, there is a lot of traffic. Some lorries sometimes are on the side, broken down, and if you are not very careful, you may lose your life, but you are encouraged not to drive at night. That's the road from here to Kumasi. Which I don't mind because it has got some very good scenic areas. So that's the nature of democracy, ups and downs, and that's what I would like to explain about Kenya's democracy. Because many of you are aware about Kenya's challenges, especially when we go into conflict. We are one country that we had post-election violence in 2007, And everyone thought that actually Kenya is going to collapse in terms of civil war. But immediately the war broke out. President Kufuor was the first person as the chairman of the AU to reach out to the elites in Nairobi. Our political elites are the most arrogant on the continent. They don't listen to anyone, and I think they listened to him because he was tall. One side of the elites wanted to have Ramaphosa. The other side said, no, we cannot allow a South African. One side wanted to bring Bishop Tutu. They said, no, he'll side with you. Bishop Tutu is speaking. He's telling me I've got 7 minutes. So that on itself, the arrival of the international mediation through Kufuor silenced the elites. And they went into the negotiating table, and a coalition government was formed. And from then onwards, they started talking about reforms. And we had a new constitution coming out of that, the 2010 constitution, which is the most progressive constitution. In addition to the South African, it's the most progressive constitution we have on the continent. But even with that constitution, we have continued to have post-election violence every time an election is called. What does that tell us? Why would we continue having elections, violence, but all of a sudden, resilience? Kenya doesn't collapse. And actually, there is no chance that if there is threat that Kenya will, conflict will tear the country apart. What explains that nature? By the way, when there are demonstrations, even when there were Gen Z protests in Nairobi, and the late Raila Odinga shook hands with President Ruto, the next day you wouldn't have known there was violence in Kenya. There can be so serious violence in the country for even a week, demonstrations everywhere in the country. And once the elites begin to agree on consensus building, you'll be surprised that you wouldn't know that that's a country that had violence yesterday. Within 24 hours, everything normalizes, banks open, everything goes on. What explains that nature of resilience? But the most unfortunate thing is that even with that resilience, the economy suffers. We are one country that does not have a steady economy. Our economic growth dips every time we have an election, every election year, because we stay with a moment of anxiety for almost 1 year. Investors shy away, right? Explains these kind of dynamics that take place in the country. A number of things. One, elite pacts, elite bargains, that political elites own political parties. I mean, it's not like your political parties here. I mean, we know very well in Ghana, political parties are formed, and you can depict that there is a chance one of them will get out of power. And I'm told, as I make a joke, that when I talk to many friends in Ghana here, they say, we give you chance to chop for 10 years, and then give us chance to chop for another 10 years. So you are known. You will continue chopping after every 10 years. Our elites are the same. They form elite pacts even when they are on different sides. So there is no single political party that is permanent. And those who are friends today, next year, they will be very serious enemies on the political train. And they will belong to the same parties. President Ruto today is in power, but the people he's with will be opposing him next time, and he'll take those who are opposing him today as his friends. Those are the elite bargains that makes Kenya's resilience very predictable, if I can say that. The second thing that we may want to talk about here is our institutions, the judiciary, the parliament, and even the executive. There is ad hoc relationship among those institutions. And in particular, the judiciary has become very strong over the years. We are the first judiciary in Africa to overturn a presidential election, and no judge was killed. Try that in Rwanda. or try that in Burundi. If you leave that bench alive, thank your God. You will not be there to thank your God. That's one thing. So, I mean, when you have got such a judiciary that stops the president from doing anything that they consider wrong or unconstitutional, you mark it as a sign of resilience. Because we have got instances where the president is told, no, you cannot do that, it's unconstitutional. The president cannot appoint you in an unconstitutional manner. People go to court and stop him from doing so. So that, again, provides a lot of checks. Parliament itself may be co-opted by the executive, but the dynamics themselves may make it very difficult for the executive to run away. So everyone is checking each other in a very ad hoc manner, not necessarily in a structured manner because of elite interests. But civil society and the media are there to check and counterbalance whatever is happening. Civil society sometimes outs corruption in government, the media picks it up, and that becomes an advocacy issue. So the interaction through the various levels of accountability provide very important moments of resilience. But things are not as rosy as one may want to say, because what has happened is that money has taken over organizational politics and increasingly shaped political outcomes. So money is playing a very important role in Kenya's politics today. Every election campaign comes out with its own unique characteristics, where elected leaders have got to compete, but they compete not on basis of policies. Our political parties are the same on basis of everything. There's no radical difference in terms of political party, ideology, and the policies. And by the way, I know several consultants who write manifestos for political parties. One of them writes manifestos for two political parties at the same time. I am serious, right? And he presents to them in different colors. But because they don't have time to read, they go and launch the manifestos. So you see social housing here, you see social housing there. The cost is the same, the cost is the same. They say we are going to have a flagship project here, and then he says there will be a flag, the same, right? You cannot afford to be different because you have been together before, and you will fall out with each other and become friends again. That's, in the process, what we have seen is that competent individuals may not run for office, able individuals cannot run for office, women become increasingly marginalized. And by the way, I'm talking about serious money. Not what I see in your social media in Ghana's elections. It's a joke what I see in Ghana's elections, during elections. You don't have money in politics. That's a joke. and don't say you have money in politics. That's a joke. You look at Kenya and Nigeria, that's when you know people can steal money and use it on your face, right? So that's what is really happening. But then there are quite a number of proposals. To promote resilience, there must be a need to think about how to empower citizens, and empower citizens by having reforms on how political parties can use their money, can use campaign finances. That's most important. The second thing, we must think about how to strengthen institutions of restraint. By institutions of restraint, I'm talking about institutions like the Auditor General to out the government when they mess up, and also create opportunities for whistleblowers and work with the champions in different ways. Strengthen civil society to integrate their voice and to become much more strong in terms of advocacy, and create opportunities to out the government and be able to have advocacy strategies throughout. But even as I conclude, I would like to say Africa needs to rethink electoral systems. The majoritarian politics that we have, first it was the post-electoral system that we have here in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, I think it has outlived its usefulness. But of course, context matter. But in countries like Ghana and Kenya, electoral system is something that we must revisit because it creates opportunities for exclusion rather than inclusion. If we want proportional representation in some instances, or mixed proportional representation, then we create opportunities for inclusive politics, where money will not even matter, because you can campaign for a political party and get into parliament, rather than campaigning for an individual, which creates opportunities to personalize our politics. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Pedase, Professor Karoti. So, I will take a couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions, and then before we move to the next panel. So, I will keep mine, but because I want to give the floor to the public. So, who has any question for our distinguished? Yes, sir, we'll start there.
I mean, thank you very much for those. Also, because you are from Ghana and presenting from Ghana, I don't know whether you followed the inauguration of our current president, John Dramani Mahama, and the one who received the loudest of applause when he was invited is it Captain Traore? He received the loudest. How do we juxtapose that attitude, the fact that there's a support for democracy in the mindset of Ghanaians from the president? It's one of the things that I was going to make reference to, but just because you brought it in, I just want to see how do you see that's the reality as it is, and the assumptions that we have. Yes. And then also the democracy of that we find given the most expression in our situation.
Thank you so much. So we'll take another question, just the lady behind.
Hi, good morning. Thank you.
And can you introduce yourself before asking the question?
I'm Ellie Kim with CDD-Ghana. So my question is, and thank you again for the presentations, both of you, but my question goes to George. So I noticed in your presentation when it loyalty and family, which is very interesting considering the fact that when you have in countries like, let's say, US, UK, political parties tend to be formed on ideology and their policies, and that's why most people tend to align themselves with them. So I wanted to know your thoughts on essentially why you think that the people aren't joining political parties based on ideology, and if this is part of our problem when we come with our quality of governance and leadership and stuff like that.
We'll go there. And the final question.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Ampachum. Yes, first to Prof from Kenya. In the matrix you presented, you didn't speak about private sector, but they play a very key role in election financing. So what is it about them in Kenya? And then I would also speak to the issue of civil society. We make the argument about civil society all the time, but you also have contexts where civil society are sort of groups of people who sit in the next room waiting to enter government as independent arbiters or groups who could actually help shape the process going forward.
So let me, the last question will be the one in the back there. Can you wait for the next round? So, okay.
My name is David Asantidako. Prof, my question has to do with the case of we chop for 10 years, you also chop for 10 years. The idea of elite consensus. So basically, when you look at the continent, we realize that where this consensus exists, there is more or less a one-to-one mapping, like in terms of stability. The places where that kind of consensus exists is basically where you have the most stability. You can check Sierra Leone, across board. And the question is, what does that spell for the ordinary person? And basically, this consensus tends to mean a lack of accountability on either part. So how do we get this consensus to mean something for the ordinary citizen? Thank you.
And last but not least of the question, yes?
Thank you very much. My name is Fred Tete, Electoral Commission. George, my question goes to you. In the trend analysis that you presented on the key challenges, you highlighted election quality. And I realized that in terms of the graph, the trend shows an increase under Rawlings more than Kufuor. I don't know. Me sitting here, I don't know what other people are thinking. But within our democratic dispensation, I felt Kufuor regime didn't plateau, as shown by the graph. It is within the regime of Kufuor and Mills that we had gains in democratic practices. Because under Rawlings is basically, yes, practicing democracy, but there were fear in the people. I don't know how you can explain that. Thank you.
Amazing. So each panelist will have about 3 minutes to cover as many questions as possible, and then we'll move to the next panel. So let me start with you, Dr. Ofosu.
I mean, thank you for the support for democracy. I think you're definitely right that when we think about what how much do people support democracy in the country, we ask them simple questions like, do you support democracy or not? Like using the Afrobarometer standard question, and people will say, oh yes, I do. And so what I tried to present here was to try to indicate the fact that we need to dig a bit deeper. So democracy, democracy have multiple dimensions. And so, do people support freedom of association? Do they support free press? Do they support checks on the executive? Do they support, constraint of the judiciary or not? And if we look at the graph, you see that there's some substantial minority of people that do not subscribe to these principles that we associate with liberal democracy. And that's, I think, where we should be concerned. So if we saw people who are praising, they probably don't represent the majority in the country, but there is some, underlying that if we don't take care, could be tapped in by opportunistic political entrepreneurs who wants to take over, the democratic processes because of that. And I think it's particularly even disturbing when you look at the grassroots attitudes, which was really striking to me. These are the folks who are aspiring not only as local party executives, but people who wants to contest as constituency level executives and then become a parliamentarian or something in the future. And so we have to be conscious of the fact that we need to hammer in these principles even at a grassroots level. In terms of motivation, yes, some of these folks express that they joined the party because of the ideology. Also, for the MPP, yeah, they are, entrepreneurial, liberal, market-oriented, and that is why I joined the Buzia Dankwa tradition. These party executives were expressing that view in our thing. So that plays a role, obviously, but whether it's the strongest, whether the ideology is the strongest or not, I can't tell you from the data that I have. But I can say that it's material motivation that encourage people to join political parties and stay loyal to them in Ghana. Quality of election. Fred, I agree and I don't agree with you. So first, I think the reforms that we saw, if you look at the graph, it was after the transition into Kufuor's regime that we saw the spike. Under Rawlings, it was not good. Like the election quality was not, the 1992 elections, 1996 elections was not as clean as the one we have in 2000. But the challenge is that after that, we have seen a plateau. Like there's not been a massive improvement over when we, so, we adopted transparent ballot boxes, tactile ballots, polling station agents, all the things that the reforms that we're undertaking after the 1992 elections and 96 election. We haven't seen, there's some, you tell me more, but we haven't seen a massive shift other than that. Those that were adopted often were take for example, biometric registration and verification, right? In my own study, like where you have monitors, you had them breaking down. So we adopt something and then we find ways around them. So the quality of election remains problematic. Thank you.
Fantastic. And perhaps before giving you the 2 minutes that we have for your final point, so I just want to address our audience online. Martin, so please write your questions as a comment, and we'll take them and we will share with the speakers, if not for this session, at the next session, and all the speakers will also be able to answer the question. So do not hesitate to share your comments. We are there. We see you as well. Pedasi.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. But there's a question that touched on America, UK, or the West. I think we need to take analysis of the West and democratic values very seriously at present. America is not the America of the yesteryears. America is replicating Africa in all senses of authoritarianism. I'm serious. And young scholars like you now need to start thinking about how to stand them and see what is changing. America is as authoritarian now as many of the African states. And dare say that, although I may not have, I'm not a scholar of American politics, but the society is increasingly changing. It's not the society of yesterday. So it's not America of yesterday that we can compare with Africa's politics in different ways. Now, getting into the question of stability and elite consensus, that's where we require strong civil society to keep on checking and advancing people's voices. And in fact, in places like Kenya, where we get 3 steps forward and 1 step backward, we are still progressing. But that progress is the result of elite consensus, but with the push by civil society and the media forcing accountability. So the interplay of civil society, the media, and elite consensus sometimes plays a major role and prevents the society from backsliding as much as one, very much. On the question of private sector, crony capitalism plays an important, intertwined in many of our societies, even in America or UK. We see the business elites aligning with political elites virtually every other time. But the question is, what does that money do to politics? If it's not properly checked, it results in corruption, predatory behavior, and patronage politics that undermines institutions increasingly. And again, that's where we require the role of civil society to continue advocacy, and that's where we require a strong judiciary in order to check what the government does.
Fantastic. But allow me to bring a new of the political system in America. I would say that the quality of democracy, the quality of checks and balances may be challenged. We may have a lower quality of democracy, but I will not necessarily qualify the same way that you did. So, but that is a debate that we
I disagree with you. I disagree with you.
that is a debate that we can have for a long time, because we still have those institutions of vertical accountability which are functioning, even if the capacity of the institution of horizontal accountability are challenged. They are challenged in the way that they were defined by the Constitution. And the fact that they are challenged is the outcome of the existing political configuration, which means that, of course, we don't have a high quality of checks and balances or of horizontal accountability. When we add to the fact that we also have a president who uses at the fullest the presidential power, which is also allowed by the Constitution, so that is where the quality of the democracy has drastically decreased. But to consider that decrease, to consider the overall American system as authoritarian, that is where I will think it is not, it will be a step of.
Landry, America is changing. America is changing. The president is staffing judiciary with his own people more than like in African context. America is becoming African.
Thank you so much. On this note, we'll end this panel. Let's just give a round of applause to our speaker and just stand here. So we'll take a panel picture and we'll move to the next panel, but just get ready for the next panel where I will call both Chipo and Jamie. Mr. Director, you can join us for the picture as well as Daniel. And perhaps you can even take this opportunity to have all the speakers joining. And please, Daniel, join also. You are one of our speakers.
Democratic heritage to strengthen formal institutions. As many of you in the room know, Mali presents a puzzling case. So after almost 20 years of competitive multi-party elections, 2 turnovers of executive power, Mali experienced 3 coups in less than a decade. So what we're trying to do in this project, our previous work is looking at the factors led to the coups in Mali. And then what I'm going to spend most of the presentation talking about is our recommendations for some ideas for moving forward. So we start by talking about explaining Mali's governance trajectory. So what I want to emphasize here initially are 3 variables, 2 of which we argue created vulnerabilities for Mali. And these arguments are based on, I don't have a data slide, but focus groups with 66 tea drinking groups in a regional capital and in the capital of Bamako, as well as a review of the secondary literature. So we point to two vulnerabilities. One is the weakness of formal institutions. Extremely weak political parties, a very isolated political class, la classe politique, who most Malian citizens would describe as being really removed and unaccountable to local populations. A real skepticism about the functioning of electoral politics. So in Bamako, or throughout Mali, you often hear the phrase politique humaine, meaning politics is bad, but it really is focused on sort of campaigning and electoral politics when this is brought into play. And we see this in the Afrobarometer data, right? Where we see that Malians still continue to support multi-party democracy as the best form of government, though that's declining. But we see a skepticism around political parties. Next, corruption. So widespread corruption throughout Mali. And then finally, I think in contrast to the Kenyan case that was just presented, no real checks on executive power. So a feeling that the National Assembly or the judiciary was never going to rein in the president. So this led to, over time, this pattern of problem solving through extra institutional channels. So using contentious politics like protests, followed by lobbying to try to make change, and often making change. And I think it's also, we would argue, really important to remember the founding coup that set Mali on the path to democracy, and then the National Conference, sort of in the back of people's minds as the event that led to a reset that set Mali on this democratic path. And again, if you look at Afrobarometer data, you see that among state institutions in Mali, the military remains among the most trusted of any of those institutions. So with these two factors lurking in the background, we argue that ultimately insecurity is the trigger that leads to the coup. In the absence of insecurity, we would not expect the events that we've all witnessed over the last decade. And I just want to highlight, in addition to our own analysis, a recent paper that came out using Afrobarometer data. I think it was published by Democratization maybe a month ago by Primus, that looks at factors that predict support for Goita's government. And he looks at a bunch of different factors, including, for instance, material deprivation or concerns. And what he finds is the best predictor of support for the concerns or skepticism or poor ratings of Western countries and their influence in Mali. That's the number one, along with strong feelings of national sentiment. So, for the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on sort of that initial puzzle, or the initial variable of the weak institutions. What can we potentially do to try to strengthen formal institutions in Mali? And we want to look towards social practices that have existed for centuries in terms of deliberation and direct participation within communities, but also the National Conference as among Mali's consultations, and there have been about 9 of these consultative processes since the transition to multi-party democracy in 1992. But looking at these, drawing from this heritage to say, is there a way that we can draw on more direct participation to strengthen sort of citizens' views or the legitimacy of formal institutions, to create systems that are more accountable to citizens, and then ultimately to try to strengthen the role of the National Assembly. How am I doing on time? Thank you. Okay. So for this analysis, we looked both at examples of citizens' assemblies in other countries, but also previous assessments of consultations in Mali. And as we've seen in Mali and in other countries, not all consultations are considered legitimate by the population, and not all consultations end up impacting policy, right? So there's some guidelines we want to think about when we're implementing any type of participatory or consultatory process, including the importance of expert involvement for sort of setting the guidelines, setting the terrain for what is addressed and how it's addressed. The importance of a neutral chair who's respected as a neutral actor. The freedom of people to express their preferences within context. The importance of addressing communal, not individual needs. And really thinking about inclusion as this metric that people are looking at to say who's invited and is this representative of the people are these participants free to express their preferences? So often we see in some of the European cases a random selection of participants in order to sort of show this commitment to neutrality. And then information and time study for participants. So we're not just sending people to debate issues, but people are provided background reading on especially some of the more technical issues. And then finally, the importance of monitoring government action. You can have citizens come together and talk about issues, but how do we ensure that formal institutions then take up some of the issues that have been discussed? And so the following are proposals for Mali. We'd very much like to see the incorporation of citizen assemblies. Under the current constitution, this could potentially take two forms. One would be public hearings of the population, civil society actors together, or there is a provision for the Mali National Assembly to use something called a parliamentary restitution, where MPs could interact directly with citizens. But again, I want to stress the importance of taking place in a neutral setting with a neutral chair. Inclusion is key. In Mali, there's a long history, at least from the founding conference, of having people from different sectors of society represented. So making sure, potentially thinking about things like a random selection. We can't have all chiefs represented, but could we do a random selection of chiefs who are interested in participating? There's been work by Malian scholars, Tunkara, for instance, who's saying it's really important also that associations elect the members who are representing them at the conference. Next, information dissemination about the key policies and training for the participants, ideally in local language. Potentially, you could imagine audio files summarizing key debates and questions. Finally, the second institution that would be really important would be a deliberative council. So this council would be charged with monitoring whether or not the sort of resolutions or the ideas brought about through these citizen assemblies were implemented in practice. So whether the assembly talks about them, whether there are laws passed to address these issues. And I think they could also play a really important role in disseminating information, Facebook, other TikTok, any medium, to try to get the general population on board and excited about the types of things that should be discussed in the National Assembly. I don't know how much time I have, but we'd also like to complement this with a proposal for political parties in Mali. So thinking about a sensitization of the population about the roles and responsibilities that different offices play, highlighting some success stories of very responsive municipal officers, for instance, or mayors, rather. Using the annual budget review that happens at the commune level as a forum for this kind of participatory raising of different issues, where parties could be present, and then parties having to explicitly declare a platform and reference these consultations and what's being talked about. We'd also like to see the debates replicated on the national level with the participation of ORTM and journalists from throughout Mali. So I know we're short on time, but I look forward to your ideas and feedback. Thank you.
Amazing. You got 10 seconds back to to Chipo. So now we'll have Chipo Dandere from Wellesley University, who will be speaking on interventions to address democratic faltries in Zimbabwe.
Hello. It's good to be in Ghana. Actually, we're related because our first lady, who I'm writing about in my other book, Sally, I hope you're a fan, was probably Zimbabwe's most favored first lady, at least my research has shown me. So it's nice to be with the in-laws in Ghana. So this is a project I've been working on with my colleague, Miles Tendi, who couldn't join me, but was very much a big part of the first round of our paper looking at interventions to address democratic frailties in Zimbabwe. So we are short on time. Just a brief background on Zimbabwe and what's been happening in the country. We still have a strong ruling party, ZANU-PF. And the wild thing is that often when I'm in Ghana, people will stop me and say, do you know about ZANU-PF? And I think, well, I do know. It remains, I think, a very popular party with a lot of people outside of Zimbabwe. We also have a weakened opposition, and I have to say more about this because I know people are watching online. This is the first time in history of the last 20 years where there is no clear opposition in Zimbabwe. And the reason I say this is because Nelson Chamisa himself, who ran as the presidential candidate for the opposition in the last election, said he's been on sabbatical. And so if somebody is on sabbatical, you can't push them right to the front. We've got other people that are interested, like Job Sikala, but really when we think about the opposition in terms of the Morgan Changirai level of opposition, it just doesn't exist. And so that creates an important vacuum, but it also means something very different about what ZANU-PF can do in this context. There's a weakened civil society. Part of what happened with the civil society in Zimbabwe is that a lot of it became folded into the opposition, right? So we've talked about Kenyan politics, Ghanaian politics, where civil society has remained in party politics. But in Zimbabwe, maybe because of the funding issues, but I think a lot of civil society was just part of or an extension of the MDC. And as the MDC fell apart, and so did civil society. But we are seeing some bubbling of people who want to run non-partisan organizations. So we're seeing some of that. The strong militarization, my colleague studies the military, and he's written a lot about that. But I'm also seeing some interesting murmurs, right? So we go, sometimes as academics, we look at the rumors online. What are people saying? And people are indicating some fissures there that might be interesting. There's also weakened support for international support for democracy. And this just isn't a challenge for Zimbabwe, but right before the 2018 election, we saw international donors pulling back from supporting civil society. As some people would say, there's just not enough money to go around for democracy. And democracy is expensive, right? Running elections is very expensive, but most countries are not giving as much money as they had in the past to support democracy. And then all of this is happening in a condition of extreme poverty in Zimbabwe. So where are the opportunities? That's what we wanted to focus on this paper. We've got a government that's also desperate to re-engage the Western community, right? So the mantra for Mnangagwa's regime when they came into office is Zimbabwe is open for business. And that has been read on a spectrum of ways. But what is true is that the government is interested in coming back to the Commonwealth. And for me, I think it's important to think about what the government also wants itself. So if they want to be re-engaged with the Western community, that presents opportunities, right? But we've also got a Western society that is inward-looking to some extent, where everybody is starting to look at their own issues and focus. But for me, the other puzzle has been, when we talk to diplomats, they're saying, well, there is no opposition really that we can work with, and we have to work with somebody. So we have to work with the government that's there because the opposition is not there, civil society is weakened. But also, I think, for example, with the UK, because of Brexit, they're starting to rethink their relationship with African countries, and Zimbabwe in particular, right, as they're looking to trade. And so the current ambassador of the UK to Zimbabwe has been saying on social media and in interviews with other people that he's willing to rethink the relationships between Zimbabwe and the United Kingdom. And this is critical because Zimbabwe was completely isolated. So when we think about sanctions, when we think about restriction of trade and access, Zimbabwe was completely isolated for the last 20 years. And then what I find really interesting is that there is a uniting problem in Zimbabwe. So across parties, right, across parties and intra-party, everybody's concerned about corruption. And so we think that thinking about corruption and talking about corruption is one opportunity for solutions for Zimbabwe. I thought this was fun. I looked at, so I'm thinking of corruption as gifts. So there's a particular individual who's been giving a lot of gifts to people that support the ruling party. And I thought this number was, amusing that since he started giving his gifts, he's given away gifts worth about $6 million. So talk about money and politics, right? $6 million US. So in Zimbabwe, we use US dollars. You might want to put that in cedi. I don't know how much that would be, maybe $1 billion or something. So what does this mean? If everybody is concerned about corruption, then what opportunities do we have? So we encourage in government-to-government re-engagement. I'm not saying that Western governments should give Zimbabwe a blank check and say, you know what, we're just going to focus on trade. But I think there is an opportunity to say, if you want to re-engage, if you want to come back to the Commonwealth, if you want all these other advantages, then everybody who's talking about Zim must also put human rights and addressing corruption on the table. Because what's going to happen is that the government-to-government re-engagement is going to happen, but without a push for anti-corruption measures and without a push for human rights. There's also need to think about more financial support to non-partisan civil society, because we've seen what happens when support is partisan. When the political parties fall apart, so does civil society. And in order to avoid that, financial support has to be non-partisan. Especially, there's a lot of good work being done by Zimbabweans who are not aligned to any political party, who are talking about artisanal mining. I mean, forgive me, I think I'm the only African who didn't realize that the UAE does not have a single gold mine. Not one. Not one gold mine, right? So where is all of that gold coming from? That gold is coming from African countries, including Zimbabwe. And you've got Zimbabweans who are saying, we have to rethink artisanal mining. We have to think about our rights. We have to think about the protection of miners. We have to make sure that the miners, regardless of who they vote for, get the money that is due to them, right? So there needs to be support for things like that. Encouraging the diaspora. So I write and think about the diaspora a lot. The Zimbabwean diaspora sends money that is more than FDI, right, more than a lot of foreign investment. And how do you connect diasporic remittances to the political conversation? And what I've seen in my research is that we're already seeing the diaspora that is affiliated with ZANU-PF engaging, but that, you know, when people engage and it's not a broad spectrum, that creates room for corruption, where people are saying, oh, I'm sending money back home because I want to get a piece of land. Well, what happens when we turn the conversation around so that all diasporic remittances center arguments against corruption and push for more human rights, right, which is something that everybody seems to want. And then there has to be more exposure by the media and persecution by the judiciary of corrupt actors who are taking advantage of the anti-corruption waves across the continent, right? So the Zimbabwean Gen Z is unlikely to protest. And I think one of the reasons they're unlikely to protest is because there's no opposition to mobilize them. But also, you know, they've grown up at a time where they're saying, well, maybe I've supported the opposition, but I haven't seen that change my life or the lives of my parents. And the Gen Z are also saying, well, it's dangerous to protest in Zimbabwe, but what we would like is a bigger conversation on these people that have billions of dollars that we can't see where they've gotten the money from. And because the vice president, General Chiwenga, has been talking about corruption, I think that gives an important entry point. So just to summarize, I'm taking a very different path on Zimbabwe than I've done in the past, which is to say that re-engagement can be critical if there is a common problem that everyone agrees on, which is corruption is a problem in Zimbabwe. And if we can solve corruption, we can solve poverty. If we can solve poverty, then we can rethink how democracy engagement gets back to the center of Zimbabwean politics. Thank you so much.
Pedas Chipo, you gave us about 30, a little bit more than 30 seconds left for the questions. So I will directly go to the floor for questions. Anyone who has a question, can you raise? Yes, Professor.
Yeah, for Jamie, sorry. So yeah, the picture you paint here is interesting, right? So here, I mean, let's see if I get it right. So Mali's formal representative institutions have very low social legitimacy at the national level, and you are tapping into this reservoir of some homegrown kind of resource here, which has some tradition in Kenyan society of these consultations. Now, what then does it say about local government and prospects for local government well, essentially, because the National Assembly essentially doesn't have much legitimacy, formal political parties don't have much legitimacy. We are basically just doing an end run around them and finding other ways, and you've tapped into this one that appears to have popular legitimacy, but it's not formal. And then their output then gets picked up by the formal institutions, the national legislature, and then the political parties. So it's an interesting, we spend the money on these ones, but these ones do the job, and then, the formal institutions, there's uptake there, and then somehow it translates into policy. Why then don't we invest rather in local government as the way to go? Now, for Zimbabwe, what's the status? I mean, I thought that post Mugabe, what was revealed in that transition is also factionalism in ZANU-PF, right? That I thought is there an opportunity? I mean, if you take Kenya, for example, part of the reason Kenya is what it is politically as opposed to Ghana in terms of not having real, true, strong parties or not having strong parties at all is that they're all coming from ZANU. I mean, they're all coming from old Kanu, right? This is a one-party state that essentially all of these elements are coming from that. Uhuru, Odinga, all of them are coming from that same tradition. And so they are factions of the same old party structure. Is there a possibility of some such, of that as an entry point, right? That factionalism within ZANU-PF being, I mean, the gateway to really identifying prospects for, even if it's through corruption, right? Because I'm sure that not everybody is being well served within ZANU-PF, right? So even if the corruption is the entry point, that still offers an opportunity to look at ZANU-PF and say, who is not chopping some, right? How do we take advantage of this factionalism within that camp and then open up spaces for others?
Amazing. So we have another question here.
I'm from Transparency International Ghana. Actually, my take is somewhat of a comment and then a question too. Thank you for the presentations, actually. When you look at, I want to open this on a plain sheet. So when you sprawl everything out, you're looking at Ghana's democracy, Kenya, Mali, Zimbabwe. Ghana and Kenya have resilient democracies. Mali and Zimbabwe to an extent. But then when you want to compare, there's been issues of public dissatisfaction regarding economic crisis, like high cost of living and all of that. But then on the other hand, you have Mali, where I think half of the problem is Mali's inability for its government to provide the necessary governance and security to a large number of its territories. So are we going to limit this to the fact that resilience in democracy in Africa is just a mere formality of, oh, there's been peaceful transfer of powers, there's been peaceful transfer of power. Because no matter how the violence gets, at least power is being transferred. One side always has to hold power at the end of the day. So are we going to limit it to that? That's the mere formality of, at the end of the day, democratic resilience, or we are going to actually look at, because there are other factors that include economic, like I said. And when I want to speak political language, we have an actual term, the challenge of the dissatisfied Democrats. So are we going to look at that side? Because corruption is a global problem. And one of the main visions of Transparency International Ghana is to fight corruption. So how are we going to check that and infuse it into this whole thing?
Thank you so much. I would also want to remind the audience online that you can ask a question, and maybe the okay, I will take the lady here, and that will be the final question, unless we have a question from the audience online.
Thank you very much. My name is Esther from SEGENSA, Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy. My question is to Prof from Zimbabwe. As part of your recommendations to tackle corruption, you mentioned that to encourage the diasporans to leverage on remittances for a stake in political conversation. I'm just wondering, how do we do that practically? And so can we get clarity on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie, Professor Jamie, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. Professor Pempe, this is a great comment. I mean, when we look at the literature on these types of citizen assemblies, they tend to be much more successful in smaller units. So I think that's a very practical recommendation. I think in our heads, we're trying to find a way that you could get a more balanced branches of government, but I think absolutely a first step, and I'll take this into mind as we do our revisions, is that you could start at the decentralized level. As I mentioned, I think I wasn't clear enough in the second slide, but we're very much thinking that payday sec process is happening at the commune level already. So that offers a really nice entry point, and trying to then involve parties in very explicit ways. So they have to be clear about how they might be addressing the citizen needs. So great comment. And then going to the comment from Transparency International, the representative, thank you. First off, I want to say that the Malians are dealing with such hardships right now in terms of food insecurity, water insecurity. I mean, I'm not even touching on the tremendous challenges facing the country right now, and I'm really focused. So I in no way want to downplay sort of what the incredible resilience of Malians in this moment. But to your point about how do we ensure, like, what is a metric for democracy, I think is another way to rephrase what you were saying. And I think, so my co-author, Mamouni Smano, in his book, talks a lot about Mali being a case that really shines a light on these debates about substantive versus procedural democracy. And substantive not just being, oh, will I get the access to public school, public health, these things, but is my representative acting in a manner consistent with what I would expect from a representative? So I absolutely think that our thought is, with greater citizen involvement, you could potentially open the channel for more watchdogs, more conversations to try to kickstart parties into adopting some of this behavior as well.
Thank you. These are hard questions. Yes, so in an earlier version of the presentation, I had a picture of President Mnangagwa and General Chiwenga, and sort of this line between them that was very dramatic. Because there is this vacuum with the opposition, and because people are online, I have to say, we understand President Chamisa is on sabbatical, but until the sabbatical ends, there is a vacuum. So because of this vacuum, I think a lot of people are turning and paying attention to what's happening within ZANU-PF. Over the last month, the issue of corruption has been pitted against the two parties, right? So on one hand, are people saying that General Chiwenga is concerned about corruption, and in almost every speech he's given that I've analyzed in the last year, he's named corrupt actors, he's denounced corruption. In fact, at the recent ZANU-PF conference, he talked about corruption extensively. And then on the other hand, President Mnangagwa has not responded directly to General Chiwenga, but what we've had are these people that call themselves proxies, right? So, for example, a former MP, Temba Mliswa, who's gone online to denounce Chiwenga and say, well, you're talking about corruption, but not in the right way, and you're trying to use corruption to undermine President Mnangagwa. And that's why, for me, this corruption discussion is so critical and so interesting, because some of the people that are benefiting the most from the current system, they're going overboard with sort of praising President Mnangagwa, giving gifts, I mean, $6 million worth of gifts, right? And then General Chiwenga stands tall and he says, we don't tolerate that. That's not what the liberation struggle was about. We didn't fight so that people could become billionaires. And he's been very clear on that. And so I think what we've seen happen in Kenya, what we've seen happen in a lot of African countries is this the sort of where politics becomes these liberation struggle parties themselves going dividing and going back and forth. And perhaps that's what we'll see in Zimbabwe. I don't know. The hard thing with General Chiwenga is that once he took off his general uniform, can he reclaim that, right? Would he then publicly deny? He has, you know, there have been calls for Mnangagwa 2030. I haven't heard General Chiwenga say the slogan himself, but does he have the support that he would need, right, to defect from ZANU-PF? And the common saying in Zimbabwe is that outside of ZANU-PF is very cold. We don't know anybody who's left ZANU-PF and survived and kind of made it, right? There's another professor out there who's gone to Kenya and people are saying, oh, look at his face, you know, he looks a little bit cold, and he's trying to crawl his way back to ZANU-PF. So it's hard to see how that will play out for ZANU-PF. And then with your question of, are we just supporting this performative change, right? Which is what people thought would happen in Zimbabwe. You get rid of Robert Mugabe and everything goes back to, I guess, what it was in 1985 or 1986, where people think Zimbabwe was at its best. What I know about Zimbabweans when we think about the resilience is that the support for democracy as a form of governance is strong. People want to be able to vote. And you see that when people talk about intra-party politics. But you're absolutely right that for Africans, and this is a conversation that we're not having enough, that for Africans, democracy must come with dignity of life. Just voting is not enough, right? We're hearing the same conversations in South Africa, which is doing fairly well on every measure. But I spent the last year living in Khayelitsha, where you've got people waiting for someone to come and collect the poop from the beans. That's not what people want in South Africa. They want dignity, they want good lives. And so that's the question of what does democracy mean for the African? And what can, because we see the politicians living well, right, across political parties. Our politicians in Africa are not starving, right? They are not wanting for anything. Their cheeks looked good. They look like they're using shea butter every day. So our politicians are not starving. It's the average voter who is starving. And so people say democracy is working for the politician, but it's not working for me. And then for the question on remittances, I have to say you must get my book when it comes out in January. That's a hard question. But because we're in Ghana, there's a lot of research that was done on how Ghanaians in the diaspora used remittances to effect change. In fact, my favorite study is how communities in different parts of the US would say to their Ghanaian community members, if you don't pay your dues, your family member is not going to have a burial site. And I understand that burial in Ghana is very important, right? So I think the Zimbabwean diaspora, we haven't done this. We haven't thought about our remittances in a collective sense. Can we give money as a group for a hospital? Can we give money as a group for a school? Something that was done by Ethiopian diaspora where they built a hospital and they were effective in the last elections. So that's a challenge that I'm putting out for the Zimbabwean diaspora to say, you have to think about your remittances as an investment beyond the family level.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Chipo. So perhaps just a quick point on the conceptual clarification of democracy. So I think as the question came, it's a very important one, and Professor Jamie also shared so the difference between the procedural or the thin and the thick conception of democracy. So in the procedural conception of democracy, do you have the space for political competition, civil liberties, political rights? Do you have elections, so it's associated with the vertical accountability? Are those elections free, fair, transparent, meaningful in choosing the leader? And what level of checks and balances do you have? What is the oversight role of the parliament, of the judiciary, on the executive? In many countries, you may have election, but once the leader is in power, the leader may rule as an authoritarian leader, although the system appears to be democratic. And then what is the role of the civil society and other key actors? That is why we call it diagonal accountability. So you have that level, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal accountability. Some will add the dimension of personal accountability, to what extent the leader himself is Democrat. Because you can't have a non-democratic leader in a democratic country. In other words, the leader who may not uphold the democratic value. But this is different from the substantial conception of democracy, where what democracy delivers, which is the next work stream that we are working with Dr. Risnik, Daniel Risnik also. So what create or maintain, sustain democracy may be totally different from what democracy deliver, but at least from my perspective, democracy, whether even a procedural approach to democracy is better than the absence of democracy. Although ideally we want democracy to deliver, and democracy sustain better when they deliver, and not just for the elite, but also for various citizens. So I think this is a clarity which was needed. But please join me in showing appreciation to our incredibly wonderful panelists. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Daniel Resnick for the next session.
Okay, well, I'm going to actually quickly hand the microphone over myself and hand over to Michael Augustus Akabgo here at CDD, and he's going to be moderating what we're calling the practitioners panel, where we're getting some insights about feedback on what was heard, but also what different partners from GIZ, from CODEO, from UNDP, and others are doing in this space.
Thank you so much. So we've heard the scholars, we've heard the theoretical abstractions try to explain the realities of what democracy is. For the last 3 weeks, I have been engaged in a program called the Shaping Futures Academy, where we had brought young people from across the continent to have these very same conversations. And at the core of the question, one of the questions we've had was, what is the promise of democracy? What does it promise us? Does it promise us development? What does democracy actually promise? And it was one of the contentious conversations we've had for the last 3 weeks. So coming into this morning, and having to hear the brilliant presentations from across countries, I think we are in time now to listen to the people who are on the ground, those who have their foot on the ground, who are actually partakers and action takers within the space. So this morning, I am going to have 2 panel sessions. One is looking at strengthening elections and parties as mechanisms of vertical accountability. And the other is going to be looking at tackling corruption to strengthen horizontal accountability. For my first session, I invite Mr. Edward Aprechum. So Mr. Aprechum, by way of introduction, is the head of inclusive growth and accountable governance at the UNDP. For my second panelist, I have Sheikh Amiriao Shaibu. So Sheikh Shaibu is a member of the advisory board, but he's also the official spokesperson for the National Chief Imam. And also for our listening audience on X, Facebook, and YouTube, if you do have any questions, you can put them online, and they will be brought to me to ask our panelists. So not to spend too much time, since we are already behind time, I think we can just go straight into a couple of questions that I have for both of you regarding the conversations that we've just had this morning. You've heard the scholars identify key trends and also drivers that are shaping democracy in the countries that we had listened to. So turning to you now who are practitioners, how do these insights that you've heard resonate with your experience in working on our elections and democracy across the countries? And then also, what do you think is working and what do we need to change? So Mr. Aprechum, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. And just to say very, very big thank you to the presenters, because these insights are very, very important, and they do sort of give us some academic ideas of what we're seeing on the ground. Largely, a lot of the findings resonates with what is on the ground, mainly around maybe a bit about the concerns of the trust in democracy itself over the period. I think that the whole idea of selling democracy was a very good thing that was bought earlier, but there's been a lot of concerns about whether what was promised and what is being delivered is actually matching. So that, for me, it's a good point to discuss, and I'm happy that a lot of the presentations did bring out some of these issues. Importantly, there are real concerns about key players in democracy going forward. So in the past 30 to 40 years, there was a group that bought the idea of democracy and championed it. But were they able to carry along the other generations? The systems that were in place to enable those generations to take up democracy, are those systems working now? For me, it is these that we need to continuously interrogate further to see how we can make issues of democracy of interest to the larger population. I had an earlier conversation with George telling him if we went back almost 20 years ago in this same room, and there was a conversation about democracy, by 8 o'clock, I bet you this room will be full. But now, there's a lot more reflection going on about those who bought the first idea of democracy. And there's also, there's a point that I think one of the ladies made about those who are disaffected, those who initially believed in democracy but are disaffected about it. And then the other generations who appear not to be concerned because they have the feeling that the real dividends have not worked out, and what was sold as the outcomes of democracy doesn't seem to have been distributed fairly to all populations. So that is, those are issues we need to continuously interrogate.
Shake.
Good. Thank you very much. And in Ghana, below the veneer of what appears to be a growing democracy, challenges that have remained unresolved, and that becomes a challenge to our growing democracy. One of them is what I mentioned earlier on. Loss of trust in state institutions is a major problem. For example, we are still struggling with the trust in the judiciary, especially when it comes to matters of engaging in resolving post-election disputes. We have had 2 major post-election petitions, and the outcomes has never been accepted by those who lost it. First one, Nana Akufo-Addo, he just accepted it, but he disagrees. The following one is our current president who also. So what it means is that there are still issues to be dealt with within our judicial system to be able to give verdicts that are satisfactory to both the winning and the losing parties. The second challenge has to do with security. Still, election security is a problem, and both parties do not trust in our election security arrangements. From West Wagon to 2020 election and what happened, and a whole commission of inquiry was put in place, and that came with recommendations, and the implementation of the recommendation never saw the light of day. It is one, so it remains a challenge, and once political stakeholders do not trust in the security arrangements, and that is what brings up the next issue about political vigilantism. Even though legally it's been disbanded, But political vigilantism is coming to us in a different gap. And even in the recent by-elections, we saw what nearly happened. And so they are there and they are prepared to really die, in support of their parties. So it's also, monetization is still an issue. It's still an issue. I've been told that as a presidential candidate, you need about, is it 100 million? Am I right? 100 million, not Ghana cedis. Not Ghana cedis, but durable, strong American dollars is what you need. And you can look at the example, the space where there is no timetable for political campaigning. And with the end of any election cycle, the campaign begins again. And if you really have an insight into how much is being spent within the space of 4 years where a political, what do you call it, a presidential candidate never rests, crisscrossing the whole of the country. Those that he will feed, the car that he will take, and so on and so on and so forth. And the implications of that practice for our fight against corruption. So this $100 million, was it a gift? What's the source? When they come to power, how do they recoup what they have spent? It's a matter for us to... We still have a lingering problem of serious mistrust in our electoral system. It's still... And that is why political party actors at the grassroots will always want to do what it takes to protect the ballots. Like somebody said, we are ready to protect our ballot at the perils of our lives. What it means that they are prepared to die. Even that would mean that will guarantee for them, yes. That is one of the challenges. So it might appear to us as if, yes, between 1992 and 2024, we have had smooth exchanges of power, all right. But it didn't come devoid of the challenges that we're talking about. Never, it never. So those things are there. As a result, what are the things that CODEO has been doing? In CODEO's contribution towards improving democracy, especially, and so also promoting the integrity of elections in Ghana, one of the things, a major activity is what we call the pre-election political environment assessment, to be able to see what is happening, especially in terms of incumbency abuse, what is happening, whether there's a fair playing ground for all political parties, media presentations, whether those things are being established. The other issue is to do advocacy. One of the things that the CODEO attempted to do, which of course, we did not succeed. The presidential power, executive power to appoint chairpersons of the Electoral Commission still is there. And so when the former Electoral Commission chairman, ended his tenure, and the need arose for us to appoint a new one, the government then appointed a new chairperson. And that chairperson never had a respite because it was appointed by somebody in government. It went on like this until that chairperson was removed and another one. And that one also has so much suspicion. Even as I speak to you now, it's a not trusted, electoral, chairperson. What it means is that we have proposing that there must be an institution, neutral institution, under whose authority a new chairperson comes, so that we can establish the neutrality of the Electoral Commission. But once there is a certain kind of political, interference or use of political power to appoint, always the party in opposition never trusts. One of the major challenges that we have, which is a lingering problem, I don't know how that will be solved, is that commissioners were appointed in the former by the former president, who are known to be party affiliates. in an AMB that is supposed to be neutral. So the executive power was used, but the principle behind that appointment was wrong. And the CODEO actually, stepped in to educate the public and indeed call on those who have so been appointed, in fact, on conscience, to withdraw and to reject the appointment, though they remain there. But from the principal position of CODEO, we published something asking that they should, back out from that appointment so that we can guarantee the neutrality and the integrity of the EMB, that's the Electoral Commission, so that in the event that electoral result is pronounced, no one has reason to doubt the credibility of the election.
Okay, Sheikh. I think we've probably
okay.
Yeah, so we can continue with the other questions there. So before I turn to the to have questions from the audience, maybe I would like to know from you specifically, based on the work you have done within the space, in your personal capacities, and in also the roles you've played. What do you think is the most effective way of strengthening democracy on the continent?
Thank you very much. And a lot of this information I share draws on work from the UNDP Handbook on Political Parties and other information that the UNDP has. Largely for us, and given the value we place on democracy and strengthening institutions of accountability, key things that we've done is, for instance, to promote legal reforms. And legal reforms we believe in, especially electoral legal reforms. We've done this in countries like Liberia, who had just come out of civil conflict. In Sierra Leone, we used a lot of legal reforms to help them strengthen their institutions, and now we can see some of these countries as examples of very good democratic systems. Ghana also benefited from a lot of UNDP support on legal reforms. Again, there's also the strengthening of institutions, institutional capacity building. The EC in Ghana got a lot of support in capacity building, logistics support provided to many African countries in areas around ensuring that the electoral management bodies build the capacity, be able to deploy, and also to be able to ensure that citizens have a trust in whatever they're churning out as results. Again, for us as an institution, partly still on the issue of the strengthening election management bodies, is also on strengthening their digital capacities. As we are aware, in recent past, the deployment of biometric systems, deployment of digital solutions to elections has become something that has been out there. And the UNDP in many countries, including support to countries like Nigeria, among others, also to the installation of digital systems to ensure that some of these electoral management bodies are able to provide results that are easily accessible to citizens, among others. So there's that belief that we have. Of course, lately, and I put this caveat on the fact that, given the fact that institutions like the UNDP need to request, they need to receive formal requests from the state to be able to deploy its assistance. What we've seen over the more recent years is the fact that states have to formally make the request, which means that those supports are sometimes deliberately prevented from being given. So that is also one issue. I will also talk about citizen engagement and voter education. We've done a lot of citizen engagement because we know that citizenship is at the heart of the electoral process. And throughout the conversations, we mentioned that citizens and their interest in the process, it's very key. The earlier presentation spoke about foot soldiers or party grassroots who virtually are programmed to undermine the process. So we've spent time building their interest, building democratic citizens who understand why they need to vote and why they need to vote and not just depart from the space. Because what we've seen is citizens who show up to vote every 4 years or 5-year cycle and disappear and show up again every 4 years. You're not going to get any results. So for us, is to build their interest and to sustain their interest throughout the process. Maybe just one more thing about the role of our role in conflict prevention and election security. And for us, the bigger game is preserving the state. So you do an election for the state, not for the election sake, but for the fact that the state itself gets preserved in the process. So we've spent a lot of time mapping hotspots. We've spent a lot of time understanding where the conflict lines are and building real-time early warning systems into elections. Indeed, just in the case of Ghana, for instance, just the last election, we helped key stakeholders put up what we call the Peace Pact. And this was signed way before the elections. We didn't just sign the Peace Pact at the national level. We virtually went around the country in doing constituency-level peace pacts. This way, we're holding the groups together. In addition to this peace pact, there were lots and lots of voter education for young people who are likely to engage in violence. And these were targeted interventions that we believe as part of the processes by which we are able to preserve the peace of the country, in addition to holding what we call the situation rooms. And these are done not just in Ghana, we do this in Liberia and do this in Sierra Leone as ways by which we ensure that at the end of the day, that we minimize the incidents in elections, but also where there are incidents, there's enough information for authorities to react quickly. So those are just a few of the interventions we do as our ways of practically ensuring that we enable elections to function and somehow contribute to preserving the democracy.
Okay. Sheikh, if you can just give us a brief overview of your own response, and then we can just take a question or two from the audience.
Yeah, from Kodoyo, I mean, traditional to our work and in keeping with our objective to promote, credible election and to prevent fraud, electoral fraud, we do close monitoring of election. So on election day, apart from the pre-election environment observation, we do election day observation, which currently Kodoyo is the most prominent body that undertakes that. But together with that, we have introduced this innovative approach, the PVT, which we use also to validate the results as declared by the EC. And I think that brings some integrity to, and that has been done over the years, and the results we have achieved from the PVT has always been supportive of or corroborated that which has been declared by the EC. Public education on election is also one of the things that we do, because once the populace do not have a proper understanding of what election means, in this particular case, we are not limited by maybe the dimension of the work as related to particular institution. We combine all the aspects of importance of elections. So, for example, we educate on the why of elections, and we also educate on the how of elections, so that citizens will understand actually what it means to undertake that kind of critical decision in determining who becomes the president, or who become the president or an MP of a country. Other than that, then democracy does not grow, and the monetization is one of the things that we see. Once money is provided to people, then they can decide. In fact, somebody once said, I think there's both the major two political parties have said in one way or the other, that if they even put a sheep as a contestant, they can win an election.
All right.
Yeah, it's traditional, and once they have the mechanism to be able to win, so the people may not be able to even assess very well in broader sense of what is the national interest to really elect. But once one, either is the family affiliation, they are just loyal to it, they've been given money, and the monetization, what we all over the place. Korea also promotes inter-party dialogue, and even internal party conflicts, to assist in deepening internal party democracy so that the spill out can also affect the larger, the broad side of our democracy. In brief, that is what we also do as CODEO to really promote and deepen democracy.
All right, thank you so much to you both. I would have wished to open up for the audience, but I'm being advised that we are far behind time. I think we will, please let's give it up for our panelists. I think the one thing I take away from you both, having heard your submissions, is that maybe it's also about time we make our democracy make human rights be the cornerstone of our democracies. Because I think for the most part, we do all the structural things to do, but we do not seem to focus on the fact that elections are themselves human rights events, and for which reason they should be the way that we should do our elections. So thank you very much, and I thank you for your contributions. So I have my next panel to tackle the issue of corruption, and I have Abdul Rao Yusuf. And then also have Mr. Frederick Esiama. So Abdul Rao Yusuf is a technical advisor at the GIZ. And Frederick Esiama is an investigative journalist and of Corruption Watch at CDD-Ghana. You're welcome. So I think I can go straight to my question to you both is, how, as practitioners, do you think the insights we have gained from the presentation this morning and in your own working, how do you think, your own experiences, how do you think these insights help shape our conception or understanding of corruption within Africa?
Thank you so much for giving me the space. My name is Abdul. I'll go straight to the point. For me, having listened to the presenters, the scholars, it gives me one straight sense that democracy provides a space. And from my perspective, once democracy provides space, anti-corruption would then provide the discipline. And this is all about the institutions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Esiama?
Thank you. It's good you say Mr. Esiama. I don't know if G-Tech is here. Because after all the profs and doctors, you might make a mistake and call me a doctor. Yes, I think that the presentations are very insightful, and the whole research, for me, resonates very, very well. They touch on a lot of the things that I have identified also as a journalist. And thankfully for me, I've spent more than 50% of my career, in media fraternity that is attached to civil society. So I tend to agree with a lot of these things and for the connection with corruption, particularly with Dr. Ofosu's presentation, I look at the connections or the linkages to campaign financing, and I see a lot of issues around corruption that we can talk about.
Okay. So in the fight against corruption, as recently with the oral ongoing in Ghana, so what do you think is working? And what do you think is not working? And what do we need to change? I'll start with you, Frederick.
Well, for me, I will look at it from the perspective of Corruption Watch. And at Corruption Watch, we work with two main approaches. We do investigation into corruption. We want to persistently talk about corruption. And then in doing so, we want to influence a number of things. We want to influence policy reform. We want to influence legal reform. We want to influence the prevention of corruption and also the punishment of corruption. If I look at this value chain, I think what is working well for Ghana at the moment is prevention. we have the necessary legal and policy architecture to prevent corruption. If you look at some of the things that we want to do, what is not working well for me is the enforcement. Enforcement and also probably punishment. Because if you look at oral, I believe there are a lot of Ghanaians, after the president won, believe that this was going to encompass, basically everything. But it's beginning to look like it's what we have known all this while, which is post-regime accountability. And even for some of the audits that he has asked that they do, you see that those audits only go back eight years, which is just have to do with the regime of Nana Akufo-Addo. If he wanted to go beyond that, it will stretch into his first term and probably go into the regime of his predecessor. And so if you look at it in that way, you think that maybe we are just repeating what we have been doing all this while. The other thing is payback. For us, payback is asset recovery. I don't think that in the past we have done too well. And we are hoping that with ORA, we'll be able to do very well with payback. But then I also get worried because you see the Attorney General is dropping charges against some people in order to use them as prosecution witnesses. There's nothing wrong with using somebody as a prosecution witness, but what is the value of recovery that you could have made from that person that you are dropping in order to use this person as your prosecution witness? For me, that is one of the ways I look at it. I'll talk about SML because the OSP spoke to SML recently. We understand that the money that SML has made is over $1 billion. And the OSP is telling us he's going to recover $125 million. When I relate, then when we talk about recovering the assets that have been allegedly looted, we are also not doing too well. So if you look at the entire value chain, I think the only place, because of the legislation and the policy reform, maybe the only place we are doing too maybe well is prevention, because also of the role that we play as civil society people, the public education, and all of those things that we do.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Prochum.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to associate myself with the comments made by my colleague. They are very cogent. What I would like to add in the perspective of oral is that initially we all thought oral was really, as he mentioned, was bringing a very different dimension. But that's one thing that is outstanding with oral, even though the legitimacy of the whole process is being questioned by individuals. From where I sit, I see that oral has given one unique thing, and that is a commitment from the top. That is the top of the leadership. And so you can find that when you interact with the institutions that are mandated by law to handle corruption, I've had the opportunity to interact with almost all of them in the space. And they seem to be more comfortable in the past few months since this government came to power, because the government knows that they will be held accountable for oral. And so for that matter, they have created that platform somehow for these institutions to exercise their mandate. And so it appears lately, of NACAP, which hitherto was handled by TRAD. So for me, in terms of NACAP, in terms of the oral is playing a very positive role in the sense of political commitment.
Okay, so just my last question to you both. Much of the presentation today has kind of featured on the buzzword of resilience. We were talking about democratic resilience. So from what you said, how much danger is our democratic enterprise in from corruption? In terms of how much danger does corruption actually has when it comes to resilience and to our democratic enterprise?
Well, I think there's, if I look at it, maybe there's a moderate danger. And I say that on the basis of a couple of things. So one of the things that works that Corruption Watch has done was to look at campaign financing, do a study into it. And we identified that people were financing politics and campaign with illicit activities. So illegal mining, procurement fraud, money laundering, those things. And for me, those are things that pose a danger for democracy if you look at it. In Dr. Fosu's presentation, he also talked about the undemocratic tendencies of the foot soldiers. When was the last time you saw somebody, until maybe 2023, 2024, where somebody can boldly walk to a polling station and say, I have come, but I'm not voting until you give me money? It has come about because the people down there are seeing that those at the top are making money from politics. They are throwing a lot of money in when they go for the political parties' primaries. And so these other people are seeing it and they are like, okay, I'm not a delegate, so I didn't get money when you are doing your primaries. But I'm here to vote for you at the general elections. Give me money before I vote. So the monetization of our politics is creating that kind of danger. And I think that because of that, corruption is posing some moderate danger to us. We have been very stable, as the study found out. We are actually a beacon around the West African, but I think that the way we are going, if we don't stop it, and that's where, as my brother said, Aura offers some hope, because if people begin to realize that no matter how much somebody takes, the state will take it back, then the motivation for people to say, give me part of what you have taken, will reduce.
Okay, and Mr. Percho.
Yeah, to add a bit, is that the recent happenings prior to elections, the 2024 elections, gave some hype to corruption as a serious problem in the country. And because of that, it has created a number of interventions. Actors have really awakened about corruption. And because of that, as my brother said, it's still an issue, but not a kind of issue we should hype so much that corruption is so dangerous to our democracy. But then, because of ongoing commitments, we are seeing that in the near future, the trend of corruption might be different, because recovery aspect of the fight against corruption is gaining serious momentum. That, look, you may not be prosecuted or convicted as properly so called, but then you may lose all your assets that you have acquired from the process. The mere fact that the law enforcement bodies are awake and they are really chasing after suspected or alleged corrupt persons, that one alone is sending a very big signal. For example, my project, is investing about not less than 12.7 million euros into the fight against corruption for the next 4 years, right? And this is really targeted at institutions that are mandated at fighting corruption. Capacities are being built, right? Infrastructure is provided in terms of logistics that are required to be able to do a good job. So OSC, for example, is getting a world ultra-modern standard forensic lab from our project, and a modern standard interrogation or interview room to support their work in terms of being able to gather digital evidence and all sophistications that you can imagine. Now, you find that once the capacities of these institutions are being supported and built, infrastructure is provided, and there's that political will, you can imagine that in the coming years, if there is that level of political commitment, we would really get somewhere in the fight against corruption.
All right, can you please thank my audience, my panelists for me? Thank you so much for this engagement. I think that my work here is also done, and I will hand the mic over back to Daniel to, or maybe it's, wait, whoever has the mic.
in the ground from their perspective have been very insightful, informative, especially for me. There are things, dimensions that really come up that we have to dig deep, understand some of the nuances, and what are the way forward. And in fact, these discussions too have offered us a lot of way forward that we can work on going forth. And yes, should I say we are a moving bus with a lot of stops and then add-ons as we go as a democracy. We learn a lot along the way, adapt new strategies towards our destination. And there has to be a lot of unlearning while we learn new things. We have to carry the populace along, understanding what democracy is, understanding that they have the power to really steer the wheel of democracy. All the practices that our institutions have, in strengthening them really is up to us as citizens. Our elected leaders, it's up to us to really hold them accountable in order to really strengthen our democracy. This has been a great discussion, and I just want to thank you all for participating, for sharing your views, and I hope this discussion doesn't end here, but would continue beyond here. Thank you from CD, on behalf of CDD-Ghana, thank you all. Yes, I'll hand it over to Landry.
Amazing, Mavis. And perhaps one thing she didn't say is that she has really been behind the organization in all the data. So please give her another warm appreciation, show of appreciation. Of course, many other people have work. I will not name it. Let me say, last but not least, we would like to be grateful to the Open Society Foundation for its support of this Brookings and CDD and IDS research on democracy in Africa. And of course, as I'm requested by Brookings when we acknowledge a donor, Brookings is committed to quality, independence, and impact in all of its work. Activities supported by its donor reflect this commitment, and the analyses and recommendations are solely determined by the scholar. So, with this, please allow me to say one more time, pedase. Thank you so much, and I hope that we will continue this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Please, I forgot to mention one thing. All the papers are online. Just visit Brookings Institute webpage and you would get all the papers. Thank you very much.